Often, people wonder whether the Axis could have won World War II if they had made this or that decision differently, but in a way, much of the campaign was doomed from the start, and in 1944 and 1945, there was just no chance of victory. So let's talk about some of the statistics and data, and let's see whether Germany could have won World War II. The war had started in 1939, and by 1941 the Axis had tremendous success. Most of Europe was under their command, and as Operation Barbarossa started, they were progressing into the Soviet Union at an extremely fast rate. However, there was one major factor that many people overlook: oil. Oil was probably the most important resource of the war, and it was essential to any war machine, especially the German one that heavily focused on blitzkrieg and tanks. However, looking at the data, it is evident that Germany was never strong on these resources even before the war. While they had discovered previously new oil deposits, they were just never naturally rich in oil. Hitler would focus on building synthetic refineries, but even with them, they still had issues. Looking at the pre-World War II data should give you a better picture. The United States essentially controlled the oil, and they produced nearly 1 billion barrels a year. The Soviet Union produced 183 million, and Germany would produce meager 44 million barrels in 1938, a year before the war. Germany heavily relied on Venezuela for import as well, but that would soon change. In 1939, the war started and Germany signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. As battles began, the German industrial production grew at an exponential rate as the battlefronts expanded, and the attrition of aircraft, ships and vehicles was quite a toll. The Luftwaffe went from 8,300 aircraft delivery in 1939 to almost 40,000 in 1944 at the peak of production. Naturally, this meant a lot more fuel would be necessary. Now, in the battle against Britain, they had blockaded Germany and essentially their trade had stopped. Now, they would only rely on the Soviet Union, which was the second biggest producer of oil. They would in turn help them with military technology and other aspects. However, as the German long-term plan was to defeat communism and expand in the East, this would soon stop as Hitler would open another massive front. Operation Barbarossa was for a reason planned to be a very quick campaign, mainly because Germany was running very low on fuel and they could only last a couple months. This was a risky but viable plan, as if they managed to get USSR's oil supply, they would stand a much better chance in the war. From this current standpoint, this seems like a very stupid thing knowing what we know now, but keep in mind in 1941 the intel was quite different. Germany was taking countries left and right with minimal casualties, while the Soviet Union was struggling against Finland, having immense losses against a very small country, even though they had superiority in all aspects, in manpower and in weaponry. Also, knowing that Russia surrendered to Germany in World War I, Hitler had anticipated this war to be very short and was expecting a rapid downfall. This ended up being not the case at all, and once the operation came to a halt, the war was lost, as seen by many historians. Germany couldn't take Moscow, and now far overstretched, their last chance was to put all their effort into taking the Caucasus region and the majority of the oil production of the Soviet Union. The USSR, through their previous agreement, was aware that Germany was seriously lacking on oil, as they had until recently provided them with it, so they made sure to guard this region with utmost determination. The entire operation ended up failing in the Battle of Stalingrad, and now the German offensive was over. They were far overstretched, and the Red Army would start a massive counteroffensive that would not end until the destruction of Berlin. Now, let's talk about some of the common myths. If Hitler had taken Moscow, the war would be over. This is entirely false, as it would not mean that Stalin would surrender. They would still lack oil, and it's important to remember that Napoleon 200 years ago did take Moscow, and after holding it for some time, the entire war ended up being a disaster. It is crucial to know that the Eastern Front was massive in thousands of kilometers, and Germany just didn't have the resources to maintain it from the start. While they were incredibly successful at the beginning of Barbarossa, they still suffered many casualties, and most of these casualties were actually battle-tested veterans, the main part of the German battle force. Now, what if Hitler had listened to his generals? This is also a common myth, as Hitler actually realized how important oil is, and while a lot of his generals didn't actually know and they weren't actually well versed in the economy. From a historical standpoint, Hitler did make a lot of right choices, it was just that he wasn't able to actually accomplish them. Another myth is, what if Germany had developed this or that major technology? Also false, as once again, Germany lacked a lot of key resources for production, and throughout the war they were actually able to still develop tanks and vehicles at quite a good rate, they just didn't have the fuel to run them. Because of this, they would have to demechanize a lot of their army, which would then lead to inconsistencies in between the speed of the horse-drawn armies and the mechanized ones. So now it is quite evident that in 1942 and 1943, the war was essentially lost. In 1944 it was completely hopeless, there was zero chance, but the main reason it still went on, which is also the reason World War II even started to begin with, was World War I. Hitler was of the opinion that Germany could have won the First War and that it was the traitor government which was a major reason why he even got into a position of power in the first place. So he was keen on fighting to the last man and not surrendering. At this point, the Soviet Union received a lot of Lend-Lease material and had equipped quite a massive army, outnumbering the Germans. The United States would also soon invade in Europe, Italy would surrender, and the front was just too large to hold. Also, looking at the military production, things were looking grim for the Axis. The Allies had produced about 4 times more tanks, 10 times more artillery, 5 times more machine guns, 4 times more planes, and had a lot more manpower. On top of this, the United States had also developed the atomic bomb, and with their Europe-Germany first doctrine, it is highly likely that they would have utilized nukes if Germany wasn't defeated in 1944. The Allies were also highly coordinated, while the Axis was more of an alliance in terms of your enemy is my enemy. So, it is evident that by the end of the war, Germany never had a chance, but was the war actually doomed from the start? This is completely up for debate, as well as kind of alternate history what-ifs. Many historians say yes, while many say no. Looking at the oil production alone, things were looking grim with the naval blockade. Saying that if they never invaded the Soviet Union and focused on Britain would also be a half-false statement, as they would need many years to be able to match the United Kingdom in navy and air superiority. And even if they got resources from the Soviet Union, they would in turn strengthen it, and the Soviet Union was already in a rapid state of modernization and expansion. It was also quite evident that Stalin was buying time and had expected the war with Hitler at some point in the future. So once Germany got into a war with both the USSR and the USA, it was essentially doomed, as these two countries controlled most of the oil. While Germany was powerful, it was a smaller country when opposed to these giants, and they didn't have the manpower or the natural resources to take on half of the world. Also, who knows how long they could have held the territories they had occupied. Keep in mind, this was a war of extermination as well as racism, and Germany had committed a million different war crimes, which in turn created a lot of struggle with the local populace, which sparked the resistance movements such as the Polish Home Army or the Yugoslav partisans. Some would say that Japan could have been a turning point in the war, but they also never really had a chance, as the war in China had cost them a lot, as well as the naval warfare against the United States. So there was no way that they could have really mounted a serious offensive against the Soviet Union later on in the war. So in conclusion, by looking at the facts and the sources, it was quite evident that the war was already lost in 1943 and there was really no chance for recovery. But in my own opinion, even though just a speculation, is that Axis never really had a chance of taking over the world to begin with and accomplishing the policies that they had set for themselves. Thank you for watching. Be sure to check out the 10 myths of World War II by clicking on the screen, and also follow our Instagram page Doran's Academy for daily facts on history and science. See you next time.